In the shadow of Moscow's Kremlin walls stands one of the most famous structures in all of Russia, a squat, austere-looking stepped pyramid built of polished red porphyry. For decades, the balcony or tribune on the pyramid's roof served as a stage of honor for Soviet and later Russian leaders to observe military parades on Red Square below. But what makes this imposing structure truly special is the macabre relic preserved within, the embalmed corpse of Vladimir Lenin. For over a century, the great revolutionary and Soviet leader has remained on near-continuous public display, lying in a glass sarcophagus for all to see and tended by an elite team of specialists who keep him looking just as fresh, or more or less, as the day he died. And he's not alone. Around the world, other famous communist leaders have been similarly pickled for posterity, including Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh, China's Mao Zedong, and North Korea's Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. But why wasn't Lenin's body simply entombed in the Kremlin necropolis like other Soviet heroes? How has his corpse been kept so lifelike for over 100 years? And how did the admittedly bizarre idea of placing these leaders on pickled display spread to other nations? Well, comrade, line up in front of a firing squad, make sure ample formaldehyde is at hand, and let's dive into the peculiar and fascinating history and science of communist mummies. Just before we dive into why on earth there are so many communist mummies, speaking of the Cold War and the near downfall of society, if you had to restart civilization from scratch, what would you need to know? How to build shelter, make fire, invent the alphabet or condoms, recreate the greatest sci-fi movie from the before times in Galaxy Quest?
It's an alien planet! Is there air? You don't know!
Well, this book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization, has you covered on all but one of those things. Come on, guys, where's the Galaxy Quest chapter and why it's the pinnacle of cinematography and storytelling? You literally have a chapter on optimal storytelling. It was right there. Aside from this one massive Galaxy Quest flaw, the book is an insanely engaging, beautifully illustrated modern encyclopedia that has something interesting for kids through adults. It takes the most important inventions and discoveries in human history and lays them out in one super readable volume. 400 pages of tasty knowledge covering 180 topics across 23 chapters, created by a team of over 50 experts from scientists, artists, and architects to designers, all originally created via more than $3.2 million raised on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. From agriculture to electricity to writing systems, it's all organized to show exactly how humanity went from sticks and stones to satellites and everything in between. You assimilate all the information, and afterwards you're scientifically proven to impress your crush into a date next time you see them, according to the words that just came out of my mouth. It also makes a fantastic gift for curious minds and for those of us who want to be prepared to rule all life on Earth with an iron fist after the coming zombie apocalypse. Using our vast knowledge to gather followers, building an empire you and your heirs can rule for 10,000 years, all thanks to your copy of the sacred text, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. So if you're tired of not knowing enough super cool things or just want a good book to help engage your kiddos into learning about all of this with you, check out the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. And don't forget to use the code TODAYIFOUNDOUT10 for a sweet, sweet discount. Now let's get back to the absolutely insanely weird and wacky world of communist mummies and their maintenance. In May of 1922, 7 months before the Soviet Union was officially established, Vladimir Lenin suffered the first of 3 debilitating strokes, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak or write. He had been growing increasingly ill over the past several years, suffering from severe insomnia, headaches, and sensitivity to sound. Cared for by no fewer than 26 physicians, Lenin made a gradual recovery, but on January the 21st, 1924, he once again fell seriously ill. It was then that he called in his cook and handed her a hastily scrawled note, which read, "Gavrilushka, I have been poisoned. Go fetch Nadia at once. Tell Trotsky. Tell everyone you can." Lenin soon fell into a coma and was declared dead later that day. Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party and Lenin's right-hand man, immediately took charge of the funeral arrangements, assembling a special committee called the Commission for Organizing Lenin's Funeral, headed by Felix Zarensky, head of the OGPU secret police. Shortly after Lenin's first stroke in 1922, Stalin had met secretly with Politburo members to discuss what to do in the event of the leader's death. While Stalin suggested that Lenin's body be preserved and displayed for all Soviet citizens to see, the others balked at this idea, likening it to the worship of saints' corpses and other holy relics in the Russian Orthodox Church, to which the new communist state was vehemently opposed. But going back to Lenin's actual demise, Lenin's death was publicly announced on January the 22nd, while the following day, VIPs from the Communist Party, trade unions, and other organizations gathered at Lenin's home in Gorky, south of Moscow, to pay their respects. Lenin's body was next transported by train to Moscow, where it lay in state at the House of Trade Unions. Despite freezing January weather, an estimated 1 million mourners from across the USSR gathered to pay their respects. Lenin's official state funeral took place on January the 27th in Red Square, accompanied by bands playing martial music and speeches by leading members of the Communist Party. Less than a week after Lenin's death, Stalin was already jockeying to replace him as leader of the Union, for example, deliberately sending his political rival, Leon Trotsky, an invitation with the wrong date for the funeral. And this is where things start to get really weird. Shortly after his death, Lenin's body was autopsied and embalmed by pathologist Alexei Abrikosov. In the process, most of his internal organs were removed, including his brain, which was dissected in an attempt to locate the source of Lenin's genius. In the process, pathologists concluded that Lenin had been suffering from a chronic hardening of the arteries in the brain. Today, however, some experts suggest that he may in fact have been suffering from tertiary or neurosyphilis, whose symptoms, headaches, seizures, insomnia, psychological disturbances, and paralysis closely match those Lenin was afflicted with in his final years. Indeed, some have even suggested that his sudden coma and death was caused by an overdose of salvarsan, a highly toxic arsenic-based drug commonly used at the time to treat syphilis. There's also speculation that Lenin may have been deliberately poisoned by Stalin, as he himself suspected in his final note to his cook. If this is indeed the case, it may partially explain why Stalin was so keen to have his predecessor embalmed, for the embalming process would have destroyed any evidence of poison in Lenin's body. However, we may never know for sure, for the last remaining samples of Lenin's brain are kept firmly under lock and key at the Neurology Center of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Going back to preservation, the embalming process was originally intended to last only as long as Lenin's lying in state and funeral, a common practice both then and now. But Stalin and Zurinsky pushed to keep Lenin's body on display for at least another month, arguing that the Soviet people needed more time to say goodbye to their beloved leader's corpse. Once again, many vehemently opposed the idea. Not only did it smack of religious idolatry, but it was also contrary to the wishes of Lenin himself, who wanted to be buried alongside his mother in his hometown, soon renamed Ulyanovsk in his honor. Indeed, in a January 30th, 1924 article in the newspaper Pravda, Lenin's widow urged the Soviet government and people not to build a cult of personality around her late husband, stating, "I kindly ask you not to let your sorrow for Lenin turn into worship. Do not erect monuments and palaces in his name or make lavish celebrations in his memory, etc., as all of these meant so little to him. He loathed such things." But communism and cults of personality go together like hammers and sickles, and despite these objections, the Commission for Organizing Lenin's Funeral, soon renamed the Commission for Perpetuating the Memory of Lenin, agreed to prolong the departed leader's lying in state. Towards this end, a temporary wooden mausoleum, designed by architect Alexei Shuzev, was erected near the Kremlin walls, attracting over 100,000 Soviet citizens over the following month. During this time, a guard of honor, popularly known as the No. 1 Sentry, was permanently stationed outside the mausoleum. But while the cold weather kept Lenin's various bits fairly well preserved, as winter gave way to spring, the revolutionary's former meat sack began showing signs of decay. Various experts were consulted, but none could suggest an acceptable means of preserving Lenin's appearance long term. Part of the problem was that during the autopsy, the pathologist had severed all Lenin's major blood vessels. As Alexei Yurchak, professor of social anthropology at the University of California, later stated, later Abrikosov would say that if he had known they would embalm the body, he wouldn't have done it. The blood vascular system could have been used to deliver embalming chemicals to the tissue. Another problem was that while traditional embalming fluid, based on a mixture of formaldehyde, water, and alcohol, known as formalin, worked well in the short term, over time tissues preserved in this manner became stiff, discolored, and fragile. About the only known method with any chance of preserving Lenin long-term was freezing, and to this end, Leonid Krasin, the Minister of International Trade, set about acquiring the appropriate industrial refrigeration equipment from Germany. Meanwhile, the committee, quickly running out of time, quietly made plans to bury Lenin in the Kremlin necropolis. But then, at the 11th hour, a pair of saviors suddenly appeared. Doctors Vladimir Vorobyov and Boris Zbarsky, professors of anatomy at biochemistry at Kharkiv University, claimed they could embalm Lenin's remains indefinitely while maintaining a lifelike appearance. The committee jumped on the proposal and on March 25, 1924, publicly announced its intention to take steps scientifically available for long-term preservation of Lenin's body. After this, the mausoleum in Red Square was temporarily closed, and Doctors Vorobyov and Zbarsky and their team were given free rein to work their dark magic. And not a moment too soon, had the process been started just a few weeks later, Lenin's remains would likely have been too decayed to save. While much of the embalming process they use remains a closely guarded secret, it is known to involve a mixture of various chemicals, including glycerol, formaldehyde, potassium acetate, alcohol, hydrogen peroxide, acetic acid, and sodium acetate. Due to the damage to Lenin's circulatory system, Vorobyov and Zbarsky developed microinjection technologies using small hypodermic needles to deliver embalming solution directly to specific areas of tissue. They also constructed a special form-fitting, double-layered rubber suit to keep a thin layer of fluid constantly circulating around the body. The dark blue wooden suit currently worn by Lenin, complete with trademark blue and white speckled necktie, was specially tailored to fit around this rubbered sheath. Yet even these elaborate processes were not enough to prevent Lenin's skin, especially on his face, from shrinking and caving in, so much of the subcutaneous fat in his nose, cheeks, eye sockets, and other key areas were replaced and re-sculpted using a combination of paraffin wax, glycerin, and keratin. Damage suffered during transportation and autopsy also had to be repaired. For example, when Lenin's body was transported from his Gorky estate to Moscow, part of his right ear became severely frostbitten and soon turned black. And in order to remove his brain during autopsy, Alexei had sliced Lenin's scalp from ear to ear, leaving a prominent suture. However, after much experimentation, the embalming team came up with a lifelike plastic compound which they used to cover up these defects. Lenin's eyelashes, damaged early in the embalming process, were also replaced with artificial lashes purchased from a nearby beauty store. Other experiments, however, were not as successful. As Russian surgeon Yuri Lopukhin explains, they poured a large amount of gelatin over Lenin's feet, but later it turned out that gelatin eventually changes its color to black, and the results did not look so good. Today, it is not completely clear why they did this, pour gelatin, probably to fix the soles in the correct position that they currently have. Moreover, they applied gelatin that was hot, making things even worse. Later, all these defects had to be fixed and the surfaces had to be rebuilt. Despite these difficulties, after 3 months of frantic, round-the-clock work, the doctors declared success in July of 1924. Thanks to their special process, Lenin's body could be preserved indefinitely, provided it was regularly checked for signs of decay and chemically retreated every few years. Indeed, when Lenin, displayed in a new, more elaborate wooden mausoleum, was finally revealed to the public on August 1st, Zbarsky is reported to have exclaimed, "Amazing, it's an absolute victory." But not everyone was so impressed, and a rumor soon began to circulate that the corpse on display was not the real Lenin, but rather an albeit very lifelike, wax effigy. By the 1930s, this rumor had grown so persistent that, in an effort to quash it, the Communist Party invited a group of Western journalists to Moscow to see for themselves. As American journalist Louis Fisher later recalled, Boris Zbarsky opened the hermetically sealed glass case, tweaked Lenin's nose, and turned his head to the right and left. We saw for ourselves. It was not wax, it was Lenin. By the time Lenin's newly preserved corpse was revealed, the aims of the Commission for Perpetuating the Memory of Lenin had changed dramatically. While initially the committee sought only to temporarily embalm Lenin so that the nation could say its goodbyes, they eventually saw that they could totally weekend at Bernie's him at this point, and their beloved leader could keep on leading. Or, rather, they gave to Stalin's demands to preserve him for all time, turning his body into a symbol of his eternal ideas, except the idea he had about where he wanted to be buried, and his mausoleum was made into a sacred pilgrimage site for communists the world over. In short, everything the man himself would have hated. As to why, there are several reasons why Stalin chose to pursue this project, apart from potentially covering up murder. For one thing, the Russian Orthodox faith had a long history of preserving and revering the bodies of saints and other holy figures. Indeed, natural preservation of a body was seen as a sign of the deceased's holiness or incorruptibility. Stalin thus hoped to legitimize the Soviet government and his own rule by, in the words of rival Leon Trotsky, pandering to the religious sensibilities of the peasantry, replacing the relics of saints with those of Lenin. The embalming process was also widely likened to that of mummifying ancient Egyptian pharaohs, projecting the image of the Soviet Union as a mighty empire that would endure for thousands of years. More than this, however, the preservation and display of Lenin's body helped forge the link between the old leader and the new, firmly establishing Stalin as the rightful heir and interpreter of Lenin and his revolutionary project. Indeed, Stalin used the occasion of his predecessor's funeral to present a new oath to Lenin, setting out 5 key commandments which, according to Stalin, Lenin would have wanted to see fulfilled, so he did weekend at Bernie's him after all. These were party unity, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the alliance of workers and peasants, the maintenance of the USR, and the continuation of the principles of the Communist International. But by far the strangest justification for preserving Lenin's body was the belief that someday Soviet science would be able to resurrect the great leader, a hope encapsulated by the popular slogan, "Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live." Probably shouldn't have diced up his brain then. Whatever Stalin's real motivations, the Soviet people enthusiastically supported his plan, sending in more than 1,000 telegrams and letters requesting that Lenin's body be preserved for posterity. But if the father of the Soviet Union was to defy eternity, he would have to find himself some new digs, and fast. By the end of 1924, spots of mold began appearing on the mausoleum walls and even on Lenin's body itself. In response, the good doctors in charge of his body urged the Soviet government to move the body to a more appropriate structure. And so it was that in January of 1925, the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee, later the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, announced an international competition to design a permanent stone mausoleum. The committee received 117 different design proposals, ranging from the stately and minimalist to the truly bizarre, including a globe, an Egyptian pyramid, a 5-pointed star, and even a ship with Lenin's embalmed body at the helm. In the end, however, they hired Alexei Shuzev to design a permanent stone version of his previous temporary mausoleum. Like its predecessors, the final design was inspired by the shape of the Mesopotamian, ziggurats, and Central and South American pyramids. Measuring 24 meters wide by 24 meters deep and 12 meters high, the squat, step structure is built of polished porphyry, quartzite, granite, marble, and labradorite specially imported from every republic of the Soviet Union, some 10,000 metric tons of stone in all. The mausoleum sits atop a 20-ton foundation of stone and sand with guarding piles driven all around, designed to protect it from shifting and vibration. Inside are 3 main spaces, 2 staircases, and an entrance and an exit, each topped by a massive granite lintel carved with the state emblem of the Soviet Union, a vestibule, and a mourning hall where Lenin's sarcophagus sits. Built from 2 inclined trapezoidal glass panes held in a bronze frame, the mausoleum sits on a large slab of red jasper, supported by small metal pillars to give the impression of floating off the floor and draped with bronze flags representing the labor and battle banners of the Soviet Union. Lenin himself, reclining on a red cushion with his hands propped up on his thigh, is illuminated by a dim red light to prevent damage to his skin, while alternating pilasters and insert bands of red porphyry, labradorite, and cobalt glass on the walls give the impression of flames and banners waving in the wind. Finally, the entire structure is crowned by an open-air dais or tribune, providing a commanding view of the Red Square. The imposing, minimalist structure was a significant departure from the futurist and constructivist architecture popular in the Soviet Union during the 1920s and leaned more towards Stalin's preferred imperial classical style. Once again, Uncle Joe was leveraging Lenin's legacy to place his own stamp on the Soviet society. Lenin's mausoleum was finally unveiled in October of 1920 after 16 months of work. Its construction coincided with the complete remodeling of the Kremlin necropolis, with individual tombstones and monuments between the towers being replaced by more uniform burials and stone plaques embedded in the Kremlin wall itself. Chillingly, among the first to be buried in the newly redesigned necropolis were several confirmed and some alleged victims of Stalin's political purges during the Great Terror. Thus, as well as a symbol of Lenin's greatness and immortal political legacy, the mausoleum also served as a dire warning of what happened to those who dared cross Joseph Stalin. Meanwhile, the team dedicated to Lenin's preservation steadily grew, eventually becoming the Mausoleum Group of the Center for Scientific Research and Teaching Methods in Biochemical Technologies, better known as the Lenin Lab. Initially directed by Boris Zbarsky and then Sergei Mardashev, and numbering some 200 employees at its peak, over the last 100 years, this elite group of surgeons, biochemists, and other specialists has worked tirelessly to keep the leader of the October Revolution looking fresh and lively. On this, every 1 to 1.5 years, the mausoleum is closed and Lenin is transported to the lab, where he is stripped and immersed in various embalming fluid baths over a period of 6 days. Some of these baths are laced with calcium to counter the continuous process of decalcination and maintaining Lenin's bone structure. The specialists also attend to any body parts which have shrunken, deformed, or discolored over the preceding year. For example, despite the embalming process, fats still tend to hydrolyze or break down over time, so the Lenin lab developed a chemically neutral plastic solution that can be injected into troubled spots to restore their shape and elasticity. Discoloration on the skin is corrected using hydrogen peroxide and other bleaching agents, while tests are performed to detect the presence of fungi, bacteria, and other agents of decay which, if found, are immediately treated using formaldehyde. While some may argue whether this biological ship of Theseus even counts as the real man anymore, by all accounts, Lenin looks pretty darn good, if a bit waxy, for a man who has been dead for over a century. Since the mausoleum's grand opening in October of 1930, Vladimir Lenin has remained on more or less continuous public display, with one major exception. On June the 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. On July the 3rd, as German troops closed in on Moscow, Lenin's body was loaded on a train and evacuated to a remote city in Siberia. And in spite of the dire wartime shortages, the scientists in charge of maintaining Lenin's body were exempted from military service and given food and other amenities denied most Soviet citizens. And when the tide of the war finally turned and the Red Army began advancing in German territory, chief scientist Boris Zbarsky and his 12-year-old son Ilya were dispatched to raid German chemical plants, laboratories, and universities for much-needed embalming chemicals. Thus, the embalming team were able to keep Lenin looking fresh for nearly 4 years until he was finally returned to his home on Red Square in March of 1945. Ever the opportunist, Stalin presided over the May 9, 1945 victory parade from atop the newly reoccupied mausoleum, further cementing himself as the true successor to Lenin and the supreme master of the Soviet Union. Yet despite the embalming specialist's dedicated service during the war, none were safe from Stalin's paranoid persecutions, and in 1952 the Jewish Boris Zbarsky found himself tangled up in an anti-Semitic purge and imprisoned by the NKVD. He was only spared execution when, on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died of cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 73, though like his predecessor, speculation abounds that he was actually poisoned. As with Lenin before him, Stalin's body was embalmed using the same secret process. Among the specialists assigned to task was Dr. Sergei Dubov, who later recalled the characteristic atmosphere of fear and paranoia when he received the call. They sent a car to collect me when he died and took me to the laboratory. My hands were shaking. He was dead, but his bodyguards still stood there watching everything we did to him. Stalin's embalmed corpse was placed in the Hall of Columns, where it lay in state for 4 days prior to his official state funeral on March the 9th. The crowds that gathered to pay their respects to one of history's greatest mass murderers, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, packed so tightly that at least 109 people were suffocated to death in a crowd-crushing incident, proving that even in death, Joseph Stalin could still be hazardous to your health. Following the funeral, Stalin was entombed alongside Lenin, officially canonizing the pair as co-founder of the Soviet Union, and they hoped the International Communist Revolution. However, Stalin's tenure in the mausoleum was short-lived, for on February the 25th, 1956, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, delivered on the cult of personality and its consequences, aka the secret speech, before the 20th Congress of the Soviet Union, denouncing Stalin's policies as overly tyrannical and counter to the principles the Soviet Union was built on. Vladimir Ilyich said, "Stalin is excessively rude, and this defect, which can be freely tolerated in our midst and in context among us communists, becomes a defect which cannot be tolerated in one holding the position of General Secretary. Because of this, I propose that the comrades consider the method by which Stalin would be removed from this position and by which another man would be selected for it, a man who, above all, would differ from Stalin in only one quality, namely greater tolerance, greater loyalty, greater kindness, and more considerate attitude toward the comrades, a less capricious temper, etc., which I'm just going to point out is way more than one quality. But either way, as later events have proven, Lenin's anxiety was justified. In the first period after Lenin's death, Stalin still paid attention to his advice, but later he began to disregard the serious admonitions of Vladimir Ilyich. When we analyze the practice of Stalin in regard to the direction of the party and of the country, when we pause to consider everything which Stalin perpetrated, we must be convinced that Lenin's fears were justified. The negative characteristics of Stalin, which in Lenin's time were only incipient, transformed themselves during the last years into a grave abuse of power by Stalin, which caused untold harm to our party. 5 years later, at the 22nd Party Congress in October of 1961, Dora Lazarkina, the former deputy secretary of the Leningrad Party Control Commission, who was arrested on Stalin's orders in 1937 and spent 18 years in prison, stood up and proclaimed, "Comrades, I could survive the most difficult moments only because I carried Lenin in my heart and always consulted him on what to do. Yesterday I consulted him. He was standing there before me as if he were alive, and he said, 'It is unpleasant to be next to Stalin, who did so much harm to the party.'" As a result of this speech and Khrushchev's ongoing policy of de-Stalinization, on October the 31st, 1961, Stalin's body was quietly removed from Lenin's mausoleum and entombed 100 meters away in the Kremlin wall necropolis, where he remains to this day. Despite investing months of effort into Stalin's preservation, Dr. Dubov and his embalming team shed few tears over the reburial. It was an awful lot of work wasted, but it somehow seemed logical. I certainly didn't suffer any agonies over this loss. But while Lenin now had his Kremlin mausoleum all to himself, he was no longer alone in the world, the trend of pickling and displaying beloved leaders having spread across the communist world. On July 2nd, 1949, Georgy Dimitrov, the first leader of the People's Republic of Bulgaria, died at the age of 67. A founding member of the Bulgarian Communist Party in 1919, Dimitrov led a failed communist uprising against the government in 1923, for which he was exiled from the country. He relocated to the Soviet Union and then to Germany, where in 1933 he was arrested and tried as a suspect in the February 27th Reichstag fire, an event which infamously helped the Nazis secure their power. However, Dimitrov mounted an effective defense and was ultimately acquitted on all charges. And then, on September 9th, 1944, the People's Liberation Insurgent Army, or NOVA, staged a coup against Bulgarian Prime Minister Konstantin Muravyov and switched the country's allegiance from the Axis powers to the Allies, particularly the Soviet Union. Following this, in 1946, the People's Republic of Bulgaria was declared, and Dimitrov, after 22 years in exile, returned to his home country and was elected the new republic's first prime minister. During his brief tenure, Dimitrov negotiated with Josip Broz Tito, communist leader of Yugoslavia, to unite their two countries and create a united federation of southern Slavs. However, this effort soon fell apart due to various factors, including territorial disputes over regions like Macedonia, Albania, and Greece, and the growing animosity between Stalin and Tito. And as an aside, if ever there was any doubt how much these two men absolutely loathed each other, consider that in 1949, Tito sent a letter to his Soviet rival declaring, "Stalin, stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow and I won't have to send another." Tito ruled Yugoslavia for another 30 years, dying in 1980 at the age of 88. Dimitrov, however, was not so lucky, dying only 3 years into his prime ministership following a brief illness. Given the rapid decline in his health and the fact that he died at a sanatorium outside Moscow, it is speculated that he may have been poisoned by Joseph Stalin, but I mean, who wasn't? Whatever the case there, following the example of Vladimir Lenin, the Bulgarian Communist Party decided to embalm Dimitrov's body and display it in a mausoleum opposite the royal palace on Prince Alexander of Battenberg Square in the capital of Sofia. The massive temple-like structure they designed, built in the socialist realistic style, was incredibly completed in just 6 days, the time it took to transport Dimitrov's body by train from Moscow to Sofia. Aboard that train were none other than Boris Zbarsky and his son Ilya, who were put in charge of permanently mummifying Dimitrov for posterity. Like Lenin, every 18 months or so, Dimitrov's body was lowered by hydraulic lifts into a secret laboratory beneath the mausoleum, where specialists from the Lenin lab bathed him in embalming fluids and touched up any blemishes. And just like Lenin, despite his brief reign, Dimitrov's image became ubiquitous in Bulgaria, appearing everywhere from schools and government offices to the currency and serving as the unifying symbol of the new communist state. And of course, its allegiance to Stalinist Russia. And just like its counterpart in Red Square, Dimitrov's mausoleum served as a centerpiece for military parades and other official ceremonies, its position across from the old royal palace emphasizing the transition to a new way of life. But as flawed government policies, rampant corruption, and other problems ravaged Bulgaria's economy and visited decades of hardship upon its people, Dimitrov's looming mausoleum became a focal point for popular protests and subversion. Jokes and rumors about the structure, always whispered in private of course, abounded, including that Dimitrov's body was merely a wax effigy, that the mausoleum basement contained a secret bar where Communist Party officials could retreat to grab drinks during official ceremonies and parades, and that a long tunnel connected the mausoleum with that of Lenin in Moscow. Other forms of protest were considerably less benign. In 1956, anti-communist activist Stoyan Zarov and 13 Confederates began planning a coordinated bombing attack against the mausoleum and 5 government ministries during the annual May Day celebrations, timing the mausoleum bomb to blow up key officials once they stepped onto the tribune. However, logistical difficulties delayed the plan's implementation, and the conspirators were arrested by the Bulgarian secret police, the KDS, in February of 1960. And so it was Dimitrov lay in his mausoleum until 1990, when the wave of popular protests and political reforms sweeping the Eastern Bloc led to the downfall of Bulgaria's communist regime. Shortly after the declaration of the new Democratic Republic of Bulgaria in November of 1990, Dimitrov's body was removed from its mausoleum, cremated, and the ashes buried in Central Sofia Cemetery. 9 years later, the decision was made to demolish the controversial mausoleum, and on August 21st, 1999, a massive crowd of reporters, government officials, and ordinary citizens gathered on Prince Alexander of Battenberg Square to watch the symbolic destruction of the old order. At 2:37 p.m., a massive explosion rocked the square, but when the dust finally settled, the mausoleum was still standing, only leaning slightly to one side. Baffled, the demolitions experts set new charges and tried again, but once more the structure refused to yield. Ultimately, Dimitrov's mausoleum withstood a further 2 detonations over the course of a week before finally giving way to an assault by bulldozers and other earth-moving equipment, ironically taking longer to demolish than it did to build in the first place. Inevitably, the comically botched demolition became the butt of many jokes, the event being seen by many Bulgarians as a symbol of their government's ineptitude. Indeed, despite the official name change, as in other former Soviet bloc countries, many of Bulgaria's communist-era politicians remained in power, transforming from party apparatchiks into capitalist oligarchs while keeping the old institutional corruption and economic turmoil intact. Today, all that remains of Dimitrov's mausoleum is the empty platform on which it once stood, now a popular meeting place for young Bulgarians and an enduring symbol of the country's troubled past and the broken promise of the 1990 revolution. The next communist leader, aside from Stalin, to be publicly preserved was Klement Gottwald, the first president of communist Czechoslovakia. A leading member of the Communist Party there from 1926, Gottwald was forced to flee to the Soviet Union following the 1938 Munich Agreement, which ceded part of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany and led to the banning of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. During the Second World War, Gottwald, along with the exiled Czechoslovak president Edvard Benes, helped to organize a national resistance against fascist occupation. As a result of these activities, Gottwald maintained considerable political influence in his home country, being elected the 14th Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia in July of 1946. 2 years later, with the backing of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party overthrew the Czechoslovak government, and Gottwald was installed as president in June of 1948. Gottwald's presidency, characterized by Soviet-style collectivization of industry and agriculture and Stalin-esque purges in which political rivals were subjected to show trials, forced labor, and execution, was mercifully brief. A longtime alcoholic and sufferer of untreated syphilis, on March the 14th, 1953, Gottwald died of a burst artery at the age of 56 shortly after attending the funeral of Joseph Stalin. And once again, specialists from the Lenin lab were called in to embalm Gottwald, and 9 months later, on December the 6th, 1953, it was placed on display in a newly constructed mausoleum in Prague's Žižkov district next to the monument to Czech national hero Jan Žižka. Repeating the theme in all of this, like the mausoleum of Dimitrov, the structure featured a Frankenstein-esque hydraulic lift to lower Gottwald's body into a secret underground lab for regular maintenance. But just like Stalin, Gottwald's cult of personality did not last long, and in 1961, as part of the country's own de-Stalinization efforts, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia decided to close down the mausoleum. Gottwald's body was removed and cremated, and the ashes buried in a smaller plot near Žižka Monument. They remained there through 1989, when the Velvet Revolution succeeded in toppling the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic and restoring the democratic government. The following year, Gottwald's ashes, along with those of 20 other communist leaders, were relocated to a common grave in Prague, where they remain to this day. Next up in our parade of Marxist mummies is an even more obscure figure, Horligin Choibalsan, premier of the Mongolian People's Republic from 1939 to 1952. As something of a theme here, a violent authoritarian figure much like Stalin, in the late 1930s, Choibalsan carried out a series of purges against people they deemed enemies of the revolution, executing an estimated 35,000 people and imprisoning tens of thousands more. During and after the Second World War, during which Soviet and Mongolian troops decisively defeated invading Japanese troops in a series of largely forgotten actions known as the Battles of Kulak and Gol, Choibalsan attempted to modernize the economy via a series of Soviet-style 5-year plans, greatly expanding the electricity grid, railroads, mines, factories, and other infrastructure, and significantly raising the standards of living for many Mongolians. However, his dream of unifying all ethnic Mongols into a greater Mongolia was thwarted by Stalin, who saw such an alliance as a threat to his power and instead pushed for the absorption of Mongolia into the Soviet Union as a bulwark against the neighboring People's Republic of China. This led to a severe falling out between the two men. Indeed, Choibalsan even refused to attend Stalin's 70th birthday celebration in Moscow in 1949, sending his general secretary and protege in his place. In late 1951, Choibalsan was diagnosed with kidney cancer and traveled by train to Moscow for treatment. However, he died soon after arriving on January 26, 1952, at the age of 57. Though there is no evidence to back the allegation, it is often suggested that he was, like many other pickled politicians we've covered so far, poisoned on Stalin's orders. Whatever the case there were initially no plans to preserve his remains in perpetuity, and instead his body was temporarily embalmed for transport to the Mongolian capital, where he was given a lavish state funeral before being buried in the Atlav-Algi National Cemetery. However, the Mongolian Communist Party soon decided to follow the example of Lenin and Stalin, and in July of 1954 he was disinterred and his body moved to the mausoleum of Damden Sukbatar, leader of the 1921 Mongolian Communist Revolution. In a series of events that should be very familiar by now, the bodies of these two revolutionary leaders maintained their exalted position for nearly 4 decades until the Mongolian Revolution of 1990 brought about the end of the communist regime and the restoration of democracy. In 2005, the bodies of these two men were removed from the mausoleum, cremated, and reinterred in the Altan-Algi Cemetery. That same year, the mausoleum was demolished to make way for expansion to the government palace and a new monument to Genghis Khan. And now, at last, we come to perhaps the second best-known communist cadaver after Lenin himself, Ho Chi Minh, or Uncle Ho, the Vietnamese revolutionary leader who expelled the French from Indochina and served as the first president of Communist North Vietnam from 1945 until his death in 1969. An indispensable leader and symbol in Vietnam's fight against United States military intervention, Ho did not live to see the unification of his country, which did not occur until April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese troops captured the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, today Ho Chi Minh City. By the late 1960s, Ho was in his 70s and in failing health. As a result, in 1967, the government of North Vietnam held a special meeting to discuss funeral arrangements for their leader and dispatched a team of doctors and scientists to the Soviet Union to learn the latest embalming techniques. Initially, the Soviets urged the Vietnamese to send Ho's body to Moscow for embalming, citing the difficulties posed by Vietnam's hot and humid climate, but after lengthy negotiations, they were finally persuaded to carry out the process in Ho's home country. Thus, in August of 1969, as the Vietnamese leader lay dying, a team of specialists from the Lenin lab led by Dr. Sergei Dubov was dispatched to Hanoi, where Ho died of heart failure on September 2nd at the age of 79. Despite Ho's stated desire to be cremated, the by now well-oiled Soviet embalming machine immediately sprang to life. 2 transport aircraft flew from Moscow to Hanoi carrying refrigeration equipment to preserve Ho's body during the embalming process. This process proved extremely hazardous and difficult, for at the time Hanoi was under near continuous bombardment by U.S. Air Force B-52 heavy bombers. As Dr. Dubov later recalled, it was all very difficult. The war was on and there was nothing. Even distilled water had to be brought in from Moscow. Furthermore, U.S. troops were keen to capture the beloved leader's body, which they hoped to use as a bargaining chip to negotiate for the release of American prisoners of war. As a result, the Lenin lab specialists were forced to constantly move around, first between various bunkers beneath Hanoi and then a secret mountain cave some 15 kilometers outside the city, which was specially equipped with electricity, running water, air conditioning, and other amenities. The embalmers first prepared Ho for his lying in state and state funeral, which took place between September the 4th and 11th and was attended by representatives from 40 countries around the world and nearly 250,000 ordinary Vietnamese. Then began the painstaking process of preserving Ho for eternity, which took over a year to complete. Ho's body remained in this cave until August 29th, 1975, when it was moved to a dedicated mausoleum in Hanoi, whose construction had begun in September of 1973. Designed by Soviet architect Kirill Isakovich, the 41-meter wide by 21-meter high gray, black, and red granite structure was inspired by Lenin's mausoleum in Moscow, but includes several distinctly Vietnamese elements, such as an outwardly sloping roof. Like Lenin, Uncle Ho, wearing a simple tan suit and rubber sandals, lies in a dimly lit glass sarcophagus in an air-conditioned inner chamber, watched over by a dedicated honor guard. Also like Lenin, Ho must be periodically rebathed and touched up to maintain his lifelike appearance. Initially, this closely guarded process was carried out by specialists from Lenin Lab, who flew to Hanoi every 1 to 2 years, but following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the lab agreed to share its secrets with the Vietnamese government, allowing them to preserve their departed leader on their own. Today, Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum is open to the public 5 days a week, though visitors are forbidden to speak or take pictures as they shuffle past the beloved leader's mortal remains, which, as the author of this script can confirm from personal experience, looks pretty darn good despite being dead for 55 years. The mausoleum also forms part of a larger complex which includes the Ho Chi Minh Museum, 3 presidential palaces, 3 of Ho Chi Minh's former residences, and the one-pillar pagoda, one of the most iconic Buddhist temples in Vietnam. But while the Lenin Lab has assisted in the preservation of many communist corpses, one iconic leader they had no hand in pickling was Mao Zedong, victor of the 1949 Chinese Civil War and leader of the People's Republic of China until his death from Parkinson's disease on September 9th, 1976. Strangely, Mao's death at the age of 82 came as a complete surprise to the Chinese Communist Party, who had made no preparations for his embalming or funeral. His passing also occurred at the height of tensions between China and the Soviet Union, rendering the involvement of the Lenin Lab politically unthinkable. Experts in Hanoi, responsible for preserving Ho Chi Minh, also refused to give assistance. Furthermore, Mao himself wished to be cremated, even signing a proposal that all central leaders be cremated after death in 1956, arguing that after people die, they shouldn't be allowed to occupy any more space. However, key figures in the CCP, including Mao's widow, decided that he should join the likes of Lenin and Ho Chi Minh in being pickled for posterity. A team of some 400 Chinese specialists was thus hastily assembled and scrambled to begin the embalming process before the great helmsman's remains began to decay. One of these specialists, Ji Piao, recalls encountering Mao's unembalmed body in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, lying in a hastily built glass coffin under hot electric lights. Xi was part of a 7-man experimental thermoelectric cooling team tasked with, to quote, getting the temperature down to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. We couldn't freeze him, that was his doctor's order. After hours of frantic work, Xi and his team succeeded in using chilled nitrogen gas to lower Mao's body temperature to only 8 degrees Celsius. Then began the task of actually embalming the corpse, which Xi remembered as a grueling, round-the-clock process. Once I was so tired I fell asleep in the middle of work. We had no time to sleep for 5-7 days. Another member of the team, Dr. Wu Zhipeng, also remembers the immense pressure. This was first and foremost a political task, but it needed to be carried out by medical personnel. We had to succeed, failure was not allowed. Cut off from the Lenin Lab's proprietary techniques and knowing little of embalming, the team was forced to improvise, draining Mao's blood and replacing it with a solution of formaldehyde. The results, however, were less than spectacular, with Mao's former doctor later claiming that the leader's head swelled up like a football. Nonetheless, after a week, the work was complete, and on May the 24th, 1977, Mao's remains were placed on public display in the Chairman Mao Memorial Hall, a massive 27,000 square meter granite mausoleum built in the middle of Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Wearing a simple gray suit, Mao lies in a glass sarcophagus draped in the red revolutionary flag which, when the mausoleum is closed, is lowered into a refrigerated chamber. Since its opening, the mausoleum has been visited by an estimated 30,000 people every single day. Over the decades, the Lenin Lab has lent its expertise to the preservation of many other socialist and communist leaders, some more obscure than others. For example, Agostinho Neto, the communist politician who, as head of the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, overthrew the Portuguese colonial government in 1975 and served as the first president of an independent Angola until dying from cancer in Moscow on September the 17th, 1979. As Angola was an important client state of the Soviet Union, Neto immediately received the Lenin Lab treatment, and construction began on a massive, futuristic, rocket-like mausoleum nicknamed Neto's Sputnik in the Angolian capital of Luanda. The mausoleum was to serve as the centerpiece of a massive government complex called the Political and Administrative Center of the Nation, but to make way for which, the MPLA government demolished the neighborhood nearby and evicted all its residents. But it was not to be. Embroiled in a brutal civil war that would drag on until 2002, Angola could not afford to complete the expensive folly. And thus construction on the half-finished mausoleum was halted and Neto's embalmed corpse hastily interred within. He lies there still, slowly rotting away in an abandoned construction site surrounded by shanty towns, stagnant water, and mountains of trash. Even more frustrating for the Lenin Lab was the case of Forbes Burnham, the socialist second president of the newly independent Cooperative Republic of Guyana, formerly the colony of British Guiana, from 1980 until his death from complications during throat surgery on August 6, 1985. Burnham was initially given a traditional state funeral and burial, but it was soon decided to exhume his body and send it to Moscow for preservation by the Lenin Lab. But while the preserved corpse was returned to Guyana the following year, it was never put on display. As Dr. Sergei Dubok explains, as is often the case in banana republics, everything changed overnight. He had to be buried. It was a terrible waste. Yes, terrible. Burnham was instead interred in an opaque sarcophagus in a concrete and granite mausoleum erected in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown, where he lies to this day. Far more famous clients of the Lenin Lab were North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, who died on July 8, 1994, and his son, Kim Jong-il, who died on December the 17th, 2011. The Workers' Party of Korea reportedly paid the Lenin Lab $1 million for the embalming process, which took nearly a year to complete. Initially, the North Korean people were not informed of the embalming, with the leader's preservation being officially attributed to divine providence in the same vein as incorruptible Christian saints. Father and son were thus placed on permanent display in Pyongyang's massive Kumasun Palace of the Sun, originally built in 1976 as Kim Il-sung's official residence. There they remain to this day, visited by thousands of admirers every year and carrying on their duties as North Korea's eternal leaders. And we mean this literally, for uniquely among world nations, North Korea is a necrocracy, with Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il serving as official heads of state despite being very much dead, which honestly the Weekend at Bernie's thing was supposed to be a joke, but here we are. While long-term embalming and public display is usually associated with socialist or communist leaders, a few politicians of other political persuasions have also received this treatment. For example, after Argentina's beloved First Lady, Evita Perón, died of cervical cancer on July 26, 1952, her body was embalmed by Dr. Pedro Ara, who replaced her blood with glycerin to achieve the appearance of, to quote, artistically rendered sleep. The results were less than successful, however, with many describing her appearance as mannequin-like. Nevertheless, Evita's embalmed corpse was publicly displayed for 2 years in the offices of General Confederation of Labor, or CGT, in Buenos Aires, while plans were made to entomb her permanently in a massive purpose-built mausoleum. However, before the monument could be completed, the government of Evita's husband, President Juan Perón, was overthrown in a 1955 military coup, and he was forced to flee the country. Evita then disappeared for 16 years, resurfacing in 1971 in a crypt in Milan, Italy, where she was secretly buried. Juan Perón, now living in Spain, had the body exhumed and moved to his house, where he and his new wife, Isabel, kept it on a platform in their dining room, until 1973, when Perón returned to Argentina and assumed the presidency for a third time. He died in office on July 1, 1974, whereupon Isabel, his vice president and successor, had Evita's body returned to Argentina and displayed alongside her former husband. And that is how a corpse ended up being far more well-traveled than any of us plebes. Another well-traveled political corpse was that of Ferdinand Marcos, the tyrannical and corrupt dictator of the Philippines from 1965 until his overthrow in the People Power Revolution in 1986. With the support of the U.S. government, Marcos fled to Hawaii, where he died of heart failure on September 28, 1989, at the age of 72. His body interred in a private mausoleum on the island of Oahu until 1993, when it was repatriated to the Philippines and put on public display in the Ferdinand E. Marcos Presidential Center in Badok, Marcos' hometown. Having undergone only cursory embalming prior to being buried in Hawaii for 4 years, Marcos' remains had significantly deteriorated, and it took mortician Frank Malabed 3 weeks to restore him to presentable condition. Given his infamous legacy, indeed for years Marcos held the Guinness World Record for the greatest theft of funds from government in history. Over the next 2 decades, Marcos' body became a highly contentious political football. Finally, in 2016, President Rodrigo Duterte, a right-wing strongman in the same mold as Marcos, ordered the body removed from its mausoleum and buried with honor. Following the example of other leftist leaders, when socialist Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez died of cancer on March 5, 2013 at the age of 59, the government seriously considered embalming his body and publicly displaying it in the capital of Caracas. However, by the time embalming could begin, Chavez's remains had deteriorated too badly and the plan was abandoned, with Chavez instead being buried in a marble sarcophagus. All this finally brings us back to the OG Marxist mummy himself, Vladimir Lenin. More than 100 years after his death, Lenin and his red stone mausoleum remain powerful cultural symbols within Russia and popular tourist attractions, drawing around 2.5 million visitors every year. According to Washington Times writer Jeffrey Kuhner, despite the often tragic and horrific legacy of his ideas and revolution, Lenin's body is still seen by many as the shining symbol of Soviet communism, a martyr to the utopian cause of the socialist revolution, a shrine for many Russians still nostalgic about the Soviet Empire. But the body of the revolutionary also has been a major flashpoint for political controversy. While throughout the Soviet period, the Communist Party paid for the maintenance of Lenin's body to the tune of 13 million rubles, or $200,000 per year, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, this funding was considerably reduced, and the staff of the Lenin Lab fell from 200 to just a few dozen specialists. In response, the Communist Party created a fund to solicit public donations, while the Lenin Lab began more aggressively marketing its services overseas to help preserve other pickled leaders like Ho Chi Minh, Kim Il-sung, and Kim Jong-il. More changes came following the 1993 constitutional crisis, or October coup, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin disbanded the Guard of Honor, or Number 1 Sentry, in front of Lenin's mausoleum and shuttered the nearby Lenin Museum. The message was clear. This was a new Russia, and the old communist regime was never coming back. 4 years later, Yeltsin would restore the Number 1 Sentry, but in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier instead. Meanwhile, more and more individuals and organizations, including Moscow's mayor Yuri Lozgov and the Russian Orthodox Church, began calling for the mausoleum to be closed and Lenin to be buried according to his final wishes. Indeed, by the end of the decade, polls revealed that a full 43% of Russians supported burying Lenin. Despite this, Yeltsin remained non-committal, for instance continuing the Soviet tradition of presiding over Victory Day parades and other Red Square events from atop Lenin's mausoleum. While Yeltsin was widely accused of glamorizing the old tyrannical regime, he had little choice in the matter. At the time, the Communist Party was still a potent political force in Russia, and Yeltsin could not afford to alienate them by destroying the most prominent symbol of the revolution. Indeed, in the 1996 election, Yeltsin defeated his Communist Party opponent by a margin of only 3.3%. Yet even after his re-election, his repeated promise to finally bury Lenin were never fulfilled, largely because Yeltsin, an infamous alcoholic increasingly beholden to the will of powerful oligarchs, lacked the physical and political strength to do so. And so it is that the debate over Lenin's body has raged on into the tenure of Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin. While a full 62 to 74% of Russians now support burying Lenin, Putin, who like many of his predecessors has actively leveraged the legacies of Lenin, Stalin, and other Soviet leaders to legitimize his own power, has strongly opposed such actions. In response to a 2011 statement by Russian Orthodox Archbishop Vsevolod Chaplin that it is obvious that the condition of Lenin's body does not fit into Russia's cultural tradition, but we should take into account the opinions of various social groups and avoid making decisions that entail social upheavals, Putin responded that Lenin's body does not violate any traditions. Dead bodies of saints have been publicly displayed in many Orthodox monasteries for centuries. From the Kiev Pechora Monastery in Ukraine and the Pskov Pechora Monastery in Russia to Mount Athos in Greece, the preservation of Lenin's body does not violate, but instead perpetuates that tradition, although the Soviet communist regime undeniably used that tradition in its own interests. Father Andrei Kurov fired back, pointing out that a Christian martyr's body can only be considered a sacred relic and displayed for worship if that individual is associated with miracles, and decrying Putin's comparison of Orthodox saints with the executioners of the Russian people. This, in turn, prompted Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov to clarify that the president did not draw any direct parallel between Lenin's body and sacred relics. He only pointed out that in every ideology, in every period, in every nation, and in every state, there exists a nucleus of shared values which are rooted in general commandments in universal human values. At any stage in history, these universal values become manifested in this or that particular way. Fast forward to 2017, deputies from the Liberal Democratic Party tabled a bill to establish procedures for burying historical figures, including Lenin. However, due to various factors, including a lack of clear deadline for implementation or sources of funding, the bill did not gain the support of the State Duma and was ultimately defeated. However, calls for Lenin to be buried continue to come, including from Duma deputy Natalia Polkotskaya, who stated in 2018 that if a decision on a burial is made, it will mean a new era for our motherland. It would turn the page from our past and show a readiness to move forward. 1 year before this, Vladimir Petrov, member of the Legislative Assembly for Leningrad Oblast, resurrected an old proposal for Lenin's corpse to be replaced in his mausoleum by a wax or silicon look-alike. And just when you thought such a debate couldn't possibly get more heated, in November of 2018, Sergei Malenkovich, secretary of the Central Committee of the Commission of Russia, called for Petrov to be arrested and tried under Article 148 of the Russian Criminal Code, which deals with insulting the feelings of believers. If one interprets supporters of Marxism-Leninism as followers of an ideology, he certainly insulted them all. But mainly there is Article 282, that is incitement to hatred. We will not let such statements rest. He clearly wants to insult the communists and humiliate them in public. We will respond. We expect that there will be a collection of signatures for his withdrawal. Unsurprisingly, given his equally controversial legacy, similar calls have been made to have Mao Zedong's body removed from its place of honor in Tiananmen Square. However, Mao is a far less divisive figure in China than Lenin is in Russia. Indeed, a 2013 poll asking, "Do you agree that Mao Zedong's achievements outweigh his mistakes?" 85% of respondents answered yes. However, given the censorial power of the CCP and the fact that the poll was taken by Chinese state media, that figure should probably be taken with a massive grain of salt. Whatever the case, China's great helmsman will likely remain at the tiller of his giant concrete ship for many more decades to come. As a brief aside, while one might assume that a practice as esoteric and specific as preserving the corpses of communist leaders has no practical applications in the wider world, this is surprisingly not the case. Indeed, in the course of their efforts to keep Vladimir Lenin and his pickled brethren looking their best, researchers at the Lenin Lab have developed a number of technologies that can be used to benefit the living, including a method to keep blood flowing through the kidneys prior to transplantation and a non-invasive skin test for blood cholesterol. Who knew? But while the debate rages on in the Duma and elsewhere, for the foreseeable future, the father of the Bolshevik Revolution will retain his place of honor on Red Square, still casting his long shadow over Russia's past and future. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click subscribe to make sure YouTube shows you other interesting videos we've done. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a phenomenal day.